I was introduced to Lord of the Flies in 1961 as the project was just about to get underway. I was working at the time with Drew Associates, that's Ricky Leacock, John Allen Pennybaker, and the other associates. And Ricky's brother, Philip Leacock, a Hollywood director, was approached by Peter Brook to see if he could recommend anybody who could bring with them the knowledge, the tools, and the sensibility of the new forms of direct cinema, of cinema verite in the U.S. That was unique, actually, in the world at this time, because it was not exactly the French New Wave. It was not exactly a documentary, but it was a combination of sensibilities, and it was brought together out of sort of necessity because this was a very low-budget picture. It was a picture with non-actor children, and it was a picture that probably could not have been made any other way. I was asked by Peter to take a totally independent second but not secondary camera and shoot whatever it is that caught my eye that I thought would be relevant, and that was under no supervision at all. I signed up to be on that film and to stay with the film for the 6 months of principal photography. 3.5 years later, I was still working on that film and was involved in practically every filmmaker-style capacity. One of the things that was most important in making Lord of the Flies possible and actually unique in filmmaking is that we worked without a screenplay. But that doesn't mean that it was a documentary. It was actually very carefully thought out. Each day, we would go down to the pineapple factory where the children were living in a sort of camp environment, and we would, at the end of the day, read with them the next day's work. This was not from a script, not from a screenplay, but it was really out of the book, the paperback novel that William Golding wrote of Lord of the Flies. And we had to do something that's basically never before been done in film, which is to shoot in full story continuity, meaning shoot the first scene first and the last scene last on the last day of filmmaking, reserving the possibility with one extra set of costumes, and one only, to reshoot our mistakes that we might have made the first week, but no other possibility. The costumes were allowed to deteriorate as they naturally would in the adventure that these kids were having. And we had no options. We had to get it right and tell the story with the resources we had, which were very, very small. So we actually were living with these children. We were living the adventure of not only the making of Lord of the Flies, but the experience of having been stranded on a tropical island. All of this spontaneity, all of this opportunity could only have been served by the proper technology. And the proper technology was a combination of what was learned in cinema verite and what was necessary for making a full feature film. And we found that the conditions of filming on a sandy beach on windy days, on days when the light was wrong, meant that we needed some very, very unique equipment that had to be designed for this picture particularly, and was unique to Lord of the Flies. One was a brilliant tracking system that Tom Hollyman designed together with Peter Brook that allowed the camera, with things that could be bought at a hardware store, to track through the jungle, set on high tripods, and no boards had to be put down, and all of that. And the other was a special zoom lens that was conceived, in fact, by me, but executed by Mitch Bogdanovich, who was a brilliant camera technician and engineer, and who actually had made the cameras for Drew Associates and all those original cinema verite cameras. He had designed them and implemented and made them himself. The lens was a modification of a lens that existed in France, taken apart and reconstructed to match all of the prime lenses that we had, which are the lenses that cannot be zoomed. And also, it was possible to zoom them very precisely, very slowly, and in very, very small increments, because children would not hit marks, and there's no reason they should have either. So when things needed to be reframed, that was made possible and relatively easy by having this wonderful adjustable lens. Basically, every scene was shot with that zoom lens, except for the very few that required an especially wide-angle lens or a particular telephoto lens. That was only for special effects. For example, the dropping of the rock on Piggy. It had to use that lens to see the rock pushed over the cliff, and then an extreme wide-angle fixed lens to see the special effect of the rock hitting Piggy. Other shots, like the iconic images of Ralph and Jack through the flames at the end of the movie, as the island was being engulfed, many of those shots were shot with a telephoto lens to compress the background, bring it into the foreground, and give an almost two-dimensional look to it, which suited the dramatics. There were only 2 cameras on this film, no other cameras. If one of them went wrong, went bad, we were stuck. And that gave the opportunity to look at the way the film was made from 2 different points of view. One, a very, very beautiful composition controlled by Peter Brook, the director, and Tom Hollyman, another cameraman, and a very good one. And then my point of view, which was anything I chose to shoot without any intervention, and would be a surprise. It would be a surprise to me that I'd find some detail in a scene that would help reveal a character. The aim of all of this, with a second but not secondary camera, is that there is a synergy that develops between the 2 different points of view. One, spontaneity, which helps with the revelation of character and makes the scene unique and never can be repeated again. It happens only once. And the other, with a fine control of composition, which could be repeated again, but doesn't lend itself to fortunate accidents, and one has to keep available to find that other point of view and to capture it from the right side, the right perspective, at the right moment. Indefinable, but both things together work very, very well. The first scene of Lord of the Flies, the emergence from the dense jungle of Ralph and Piggy onto an open, deserted beach, represents a really good example of the integration of 2 styles of filmmaking. One, the opportunistic point of view, and the other, the controlled point of view. In that scene, by some stroke of good luck, a pelican had entered the frame and landed in the water some distance away. The next shot was a shot of Piggy trying to take his shoes off.
Aren't you coming in? Oh, it's hot.
There's a sort of little dance that Piggy does, which was not directed, it was not suggested, but it was truly a part of his character. It actually was a shot of opportunity, a shot that appeared, and it helped make that scene come alive. It revealed character that couldn't have been revealed really any other way because it was totally spontaneous. And then by the next good fortune, the pelican took off and flew away right through the frame, and the scene resolved.
Are there any grown-ups?
That synergy of two different points of view actually made for a complete scene, and a completely satisfying scene. The orgy scene on the beach, the great beach party, in which Simon is killed, was one of the most complicated and difficult things to film, because it had to go through so many different phases of development, of energy, of dramatics, of light, of mood. And I think it was accomplished very well by the two different points of view. One, that a point of view that needed to express the continuity of it, tell the story of it, and the other that needed to express the fantasy and the impression of something way out of control. We had no lights. There were sticks with torches on top of them, but they don't light faces, they don't light background, and they burn out. We had a roaring fire, and we had something that was quite unusual, and that is that we'd managed to get the Marines who were stationed on the base to give us some of their out-of-date pyrotechnic grenades. They burn with a bright white light for about 16 to 18 minutes. They're very dangerous, so the handling of them had to be very careful, and in many cases they were set way away from the children and in front of a shiny board, a reflector, to throw light into the scene, and in some cases they were put way in the background. But the impressionistic images of violence and of the loss of any kind of civilized control occurred in flashes, a moment of something that you can't quite understand, you can't quite put the image together, but yet it fills you with sort of fear. This was all done in one night, and in fact, the editing, the assembly of it was done largely in one night, looked at the next day. A few things changed and a few things added and a few things subtracted, but basically remained intact from the first cut till what you're seeing now on the screen. In the final stages of post-production, it became clear that we had to do the same sort of work with the sound that we had done with the images. The sound, The Lord of the Flies, was completely innovative. It was the first picture that was actually recorded in sync by a Nagra, actually two Nagras, and it was a machine that weighed 10, 12 pounds that we could put on our shoulder and go and record any place. It liberated the making of Lord of the Flies in the same way that it had liberated the making of the new documentary, Cinema Verite, a year before that. It was possible to make soundtracks in the same way that we made images by opportunity. Every sound that we could find that we thought might be relevant to the picture was recorded, cataloged, and used to construct tracks that were not realistic sound, like the pushing of the rock into the jungle and the birds crying, but sounds that were impressionistic and conveyed much more than the realistic sound could ever portray. We recorded sync production sound. Most of it was used, but the problem is that we see in many cases waves breaking in the background. We hear the wave building, and then it's abruptly cut off when we go to another shot. So we sent the recordist from Townsend Productions, which is where the picture was mixed, the re-recording mix here in New York, to Jones Beach for 2 weeks and had him record day and night every wave, different wave sound breaking on the beach, storms, thunder, every kind of effect that the ocean could produce. And in some cases, we made as many as 18 loops of those things. That was a very, very complicated procedure. And if you have a look at the cue sheet for the re-recording mix, which is a part of every film, done very differently now than it was in 1962, you'll see just how complicated they are. So that those loops, which were running continuously as a wave was about to be cut off by a cut to something else, you at least hear it resolve by turning up the pot on the mixing console. We get the end of the wave. And that, too, was a dramatic element of the film that had to be constructed by hand. It had to be equally powerful as the image.
Come here. Got piggy specs. I'll start a fire. Must be in here somewhere.
The last scene in the film, the island in flames, all of that sound was not recorded live. It's not sync sound. That soundtrack was made of bits and pieces of wild lines, of lines that were recorded in other parts of the film, of lines that were spoken in the jungle when we needed to just have background talk. There are many, many, many voice tracks called vocal effects, vocal FX, and they're all lines that go together to make a terrifying set of threats out of that scene. The contrast also is the absolute dead silence when Ralph, crawling through probably the worst ordeal you could imagine, arrives at the feet of the British naval officer. All of those dramatics, all of the support for that came from constructing a soundtrack of natural sounds, of unnatural sounds, of complete sort of musical, of a montage, a sound montage. I think that's illustrated well in that cue sheet, and I think the effect of it was extremely dramatic. The way we assembled and originally shot the film is, I think, what accounts for the fact that that film is still popular today, it is still in release today, and probably is here to stay.
Kyrie, 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 eleison, Kyrie.